Espero que você. Alô, boa tarde para todo mundo. Só agora que eu vi que está transmitindo. Para quem não me conhece, meu nome é Gabriela e eu fui convidada para fazer a apresentação do nosso palestrante de abertura. Vai ser um grande prazer para mim fazer essa apresentação, mas como o professor não fala português, então eu vou fazer a apresentação dele em inglês, tá? Para ele saber o que a gente está falando. Então, começando tudo de novo. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to introduce our opening speaker today, Dr. Alan Mackie. Dr. Mackie is the head of the School of Food Science and Nutrition of the University of Leeds in the UK. And this school ranks among the top 100 in the world for food science and technology and was awarded this year School of the Year in the Leeds Partnership Award. Dr. Mackie holds the chair in colloid chemistry, and his areas of expertise are simulating upper gastrointestinal tract digestion, food colloids, interfacial properties, lipid hydrolysis, mucins and mucosal interaction. Some of us, researchers of our program that is celebrating 10 years, we researchers have been trying to collaborate with Dr. Mackie for some time now, but the pandemic has hindered all our efforts. And so it is with great pleasure that we are going to attend today's lecture. I hope everybody enjoys it. So, Dr. Mackie, thank you very much for your presence. Please feel free to start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. And thank you to you and Edira for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. And I apologize to everybody that I'm speaking in English and not in Portuguese, but I'm afraid I have very, very poor Portuguese. So I hope you'll bear with me, and I'll try to make sure that I don't go too quickly for everyone. Okay, I've been asked to talk about the role of food science in delivering more sustainable, healthier diets, which is very much the focus of food science, and especially for research, the focus of much activity at the moment. So, by way of introduction, let us talk about why these areas are important. So, we know that climate is quickly changing and we need to limit our carbon footprint while we still have time. We know that pollution is causing additional damage, with microplastics now found everywhere on the planet that people look for them. And clean water is at a premium in many different places. And at the same time, malnutrition, and by that I mean poor diet. So that might be poor in the sense of inadequate, so insufficient nutrients, or poor in the sense of too many nutrients, so obesity. And both are now becoming widespread throughout the world, but obviously in different places. So how can food science help with all of these problems? And what is the role of food science in delivering a more sustainable, healthier diet? Well, first, let's explore what we mean by sustainable in relation to our diet. So, normally by sustainable, we mean that future generations should have the same opportunities to feed themselves through agriculture that we have. And if that's really our definition, then I think potentially we already have some problems if we don't change the way that we behave, both in terms of production of food and also consumption of food. So we can, or perhaps we must, change our diets to make something more effective if we are to feed the 9 to 10 billion global population that is predicted by the year 2100. And this will involve, for sure, a move to more plant-based diets, especially in developed countries. It will involve a reduction in waste in all stages of the food system, and it will mean being more energy efficient in terms of processing and also the distribution of food. So, how do we think about feeding the world? Well, if we look at progress, we know that we can be more efficient because conversion of plant material into animal matter is only about 10% efficient, and about 1/3 of the global cereal production is fed to animals. So we can already see clearly where some benefits could be made. However, the reality is quite counter to that. So over the past 50 years, a 1.5-fold increase in the global numbers of cattle and sheep and goats, with equivalent increases of 2.5-fold or 4.5-fold for pigs and chickens. So meat production and consumption, of course, is going up markedly. And this is driven by increasing global wealth. So as countries become more affluent, they want to consume more meat. Although, interestingly, maybe in the developed countries, there is now also a push in the more affluent areas away from meat because of interest in the climate and the impact that meat production has on the climate. And you can see the changes from the figures on the left here. But where is it that these changes are really being felt? This is a graph showing the agricultural area that is, so that the area of land that is being used for agriculture over time from the year 1600 through to 2016. And there are some key countries where you see really significant growth and others where you see less. So already by 1600, Europe had a lot of agriculture, and very little actually has changed in the last few hundred years in terms of the area of land being used for agriculture. So this region is nearly static, but other countries such as in particular Brazil, Latin America, Canada, and especially the US from, I guess, the 19th century. So for the last 200 years, but especially the last 100 years, really saw an increase in the area of land being used for agriculture. So we have converted large areas of the world from their natural system to producing food for the world to consume. Now, if we're to do something about this, we need to think about where the decision processes are that influences to move in a direction that will alter our behavior to improve things. So, where do we need to influence decisions in the right direction? And there are a number of different stages. So, we need to influence the consumer and alter behavior of individuals in terms of what they're consuming at individual level, because they're the purchasers that drive, for example, the primary producers in the end. So individual decisions can influence the success of products in shops that are being sold to the consumers. And this has impacts at different levels. So we can think of household, shop, and family. And we can also think of broader communities. And so we need to know and understand where the decisions are made so that we can influence in the right place in order to make the changes that we need to make food practices more sustainable. So, for example, it is not useful for primary producers to produce a much more sustainable crop if nobody is going to buy that crop as food. So it needs to push for change at all the relevant places in this diagram. So in order to move to plant-based diets, or at least to more plant-based diets, innovations in food systems hold the promise of playing a radical role in transitions from the current dominant food regime towards a new, more sustainable regime. Besides interventions to support the uptake of innovations by small groups of people, so for example, in the primary production through farmers using a certain green technology, or at the other end for consumers eating novel plant protein products, there needs to be a better understanding and a policy agenda to support such innovations to become more mainstream, enabling them to forge a redesign of the current dominant food system. What does that mean? Well, in short, it means that small steps are not enough, and we need a population level change in diet and behavior if we are to have a real impact on climate change before the Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees is exceeded, because otherwise climate is not going to be kept under control. So as part of that move towards plant diets, I think there is a strong role to play at different levels. So we can look at how we make plant-based systems more palatable. So if we look at a typical plant-based system, you see the meal on the left looks really appetizing, but more commonly consumed perhaps is the one in the center, which is a meat-based equivalent of something similar. And people buy meat because they like the flavor, they like the texture, and it's to do with palatability as well as anything else. And it's that palatability that can be difficult to mimic. And now we have a lot of systems that start to look more like the image on the right. And is that plant-based or is that meat-based? It's becoming hard to tell. So food science can push us towards that, so that people are maybe eating plant-based, but it has the organoleptic properties, it has the attraction and the taste and the smell of a meat-based system. So I think we don't just need to go directly for the plant-based systems as the image on the left, but we can have a transition that involves something that looks like a meat system and tastes like a meat system, but is more sustainable. And that's what the image on the right is about. And as part of that move, we need to understand how we improve plant-based ingredient functionality by processing. We know that there are lots of issues associated with plant-based systems, especially if we want to use them as ingredients in food or feed systems as opposed to the raw material. So if you want to use them as an ingredient, you need to have something that is maybe soluble and temperature stable. You need to enhance gelling properties or emulsifying properties. You might need to reduce allergenicity or improve digestibility. You might need something that is more acid stable. You might need to improve bioactive properties, or at least make available the bioactive properties of the food. You might need to increase the umami flavor, particularly if we're looking at something that is to replace meat. And in particular, to balance the flavors to give a much more acceptable acceptable product. And that might include things like increasing the umami or the savory flavors and reducing bitterness. And all of these can be achieved by a number of different processes. So, for this example, is using enzymes, so forms of bioprocessing, so that we can hydrolyze these products in a way that gives us the functionality that we're looking for. So these are the sorts of futures that we need food science to address in order that we can have attractive food that is more sustainable. So it's a necessity if we are to keep a diet that looks like it does now, but with a little time spent on meal preparation. The other area that we have a problem, of course, is in food waste. And the issue comes that from food waste, where the issue comes from in food waste depends a little bit on which countries we're talking about. So the makeup of total food waste in developed and developing countries is rather different. So retail, food service, and home and municipal categories are combined in this graph for developing countries. But you can see that the transport and processing is really a key area where there is significant loss in developed countries, whereas in developed countries such as USA and to a lesser extent the UK, the transport and processing is relatively efficient, and actually it's the home where there is loss and the municipal. So there is a lot of food waste either in the homes or in food outlets, in restaurants and fast food outlets. So that's where the waste needs to be improved, and so we need to have different targets depending on which countries we're looking at. And these will need to change over time as well. So we can look at this in a little more detail. I apologize that this figure is not of very high quality, but I hope that you can read it okay. So if we run from the top left, we can see where we have a surplus of food, then really we should be just cutting down. This is about understanding the supply and preventing oversupply in order to minimize food surplus. So this is about prevention and minimization at source. However, if that's not possible, then for foods with long shelf lives, such as canned foods, or actually even other foods that have sufficient shelf life, and it needn't be very long, then they can be reused and repurposed for redistribution. And certainly in the UK, there are now a number of organizations that make sure that we reuse what would previously have been seen as food waste. So we have now markets that resell and repurpose these types of food that would have been waste. And indeed, until before the pandemic, there were a number of cafes around the university and around the city of Leeds that used this principle, and they used food that would otherwise have been thrown away, and it was perfectly edible. Of course, there's a difference between what we can repurpose in terms of food for human use and animal use. So the next level down, the inedible parts of food, food after expiration date, defective food that cannot be repurposed for human food, can be used as animal feed under the right conditions. And food that has lost its nutritional value um, as inedible material, such as peel, so things that have really high fiber, can be recycled and recovered and repurposed, even to the extent of using them in packaging as bioplastics, etc. nutrient recovery, so we can also revalorize so-called inedible foods such as cooking oil, dead animals, mixed household waste, rotten food, and this requires obviously more complex nutrient recovery using digesters and fermentation to form compost and for land applications. And then further down, as part of that process, we can also recover energy. So you can have biofuels, but the thermal energy released as part of the degradation can also be used, as well as potentially gases released from the process as well. So energy recovery from that is also used. Now, if we apply all of these, we can minimize at the bottom the amount of material going to landfill and incineration, because we want to make that as small as possible. Ideally, it should be zero if we want to have a sustainable economy. You can't keep burying material forever. And indeed, burning it also has consequences. So that part needs to be minimized. And we need to think about the processes that we put in place in order to minimize that. We also need to think about the amount of energy used for different processes. And here is just an example of different amounts of energy, either in terms of electricity or fuel, that it takes to produce different things. So I'm sure you're already aware that things like crisps and French fries are quite energy intensive because of the high levels of thermal processing. But also other materials can also be relatively high. So think about milk powders. Again, the formation of the powders can be energy expensive, and lots of products can essentially cause problems because of the amount of energy. So we need to think about processing methods that might be more efficient and mean that we can produce them with less energy. And when we think about how companies are viewing this, then most companies are looking for more automation and control. So they have realized that if you control a process more tightly, you can be more efficient. And if you automate systems, you can be more efficient. So that's where they're looking. They're also looking to be more efficient with heat exchangers and have better thermal recovery, particularly around refrigeration, but also in terms of thermal processing, where you need to have maybe a pasteurization or a sterilization step and then cool the material down, that you can recover some of the energy as part of that process. The use of variable speed motors has also been introduced as a way of saving energy. Alternative energy sources, of course, are important. Certainly in the UK and in Northern Europe, generally, there is a big move to more alternative energy sources such as solar and wind power. And everywhere is moving to LED lighting. And also, I think training the workforce to think about a culture of energy efficiency. But I think these are applicable to any organization. They're not specific to the food industry. All industries are looking at these sorts of savings. So what could we be looking at as food scientists? Well, I think what used to be called novel processes are interesting and getting more so. So things like inline microwave and high pressure processing offer opportunities. Also, other non-thermal methods such as pulse electric field, cold plasma, UV, etc. All of these have potential for more efficient processing and better processing. And then also the link between the different locations, so the farm and the processing plant and the consumer, also needs to be more efficient. And we can think about use of electric vehicles and more locally sourced material. So there, do we think about high tech and high food miles? So you can see an automated truck at the top there. Or should we be thinking more about growing locally? So using the urban environment to grow food, or at least close to cities, and limiting our diet more so that we keep food miles down. I think we need to think about all of these issues in terms of sustainability. The next thing I want to think about is also the effect of processing on food. So one of the things that is becoming more widely accepted is that over processing of food is not a good thing. So this idea of ultra processing, and I think this is where actually Brazil has been quite at the front of these ideas. The potential impacts of ultra processed foods on, in this case, the 6 dimensions of the food system sustainability. So here we can see the impact, and we know that high or regular consumption of these ultra processed foods has been consistently associated with a higher prevalence of many chronic diseases associated with obesity and metabolic dysregulation. But these studies have tended to focus on that link in order to understand it. So the link between food and health has been long made, and I think people are expecting it. But I think the dietary guidelines here in Brazil suggest that the massive consumption of ultra processed foods is also associated with an increase in the degradation of culinary traditions, of social life, and of the environment. And I would say, particularly, the culinary traditions are important. And now, in a lot of developed societies, people are not interested in cooking. They don't cook very much. They want food pre-prepared or with minimal preparation. And interestingly, I was listening to the radio today, and they were talking about some statistics that had come out saying that vegetarians now consume more ultra processed foods than meat eaters. And this, I think, links more to this idea of culinary traditions and social life, and understanding the link between food and cooking and health and sustainability. And I think that it's not a simple matter of meat eaters or vegetarians. I think this is an extra dimension that makes things more complicated. And this is really an example of what we're talking about. So you take original raw foods that may be cellular matrices, and then we take them apart and we form ingredients, and then we combine them into a new food structure that combines those ingredients, but we now add other things as well. So we add texture agents, we add taste enhancers, we add dyes because we want bright colors, we add aromas because people want something that is very aromatic, very smells good, and we add sweeteners because everybody is now addicted to sugar. So we put too much sugar in these things. Unfortunately, our evolution has driven us towards this. So we're evolutionarily driven towards high fat and high sugar systems, and this is not good for us. And if we look at how consumption is associated with fast food and also health, you may be surprised. I found this list of the top 10 consumers by nation of fast food. The USA, of course, is the top. But surprisingly, France also consumes a lot of fast food, and Canada and the UK, I'm afraid we're also there. And then South Korea and Japan and Austria, etc. So lots of countries that have issues around metabolic disease and overconsumption of fast food, but actually generally overconsumption. And this consumption is linked with the lack of time, or the lack of willingness, or the lack of knowledge of how to cook, and the low price, and I would say actually the low value placed on food in these societies. and it is not good. We should value for food more. And I think if we did that, we would put more effort into food, and we wouldn't have the metabolic disease and obesity and overconsumption that we currently have. So food structure is not just about ingredients. So I just explained that the ultra processed foods are about taking food structure, disassembling it, creating ingredients, and then reforming. And actually, it's not just about understanding the ingredients, it's that taking the food structure apart to form the ingredients that maybe is causing us the problem. And not being able to create the structures that we need is also part of the problem. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about my specific research around the food matrix and food structure. So we know that multi-scale structures affect palatability and bioactive release. So, and that ranges really from molecular, so specific structures affect the rate of digestion and how they break down. The arrangement of those molecules into supramolecular structures can also impact it. So the way that things aggregate, either as the food or post consumption, how they might aggregate in the stomach can have a big impact on how they digest and then appetite. At the larger scale, pre-consumption, you have cellular systems, and we will actually talk about this if I have time towards the end of the talk. And of course, macroscopic, and that's what we see in terms of the food. It is bite size, and that's the appeal at that large scale. And we know that all of these length scales have an impact on accessibility, release, diffusion, absorption, availability, and digestibility. And by availability, I mean nutrient and bioactive availability. So let's talk a little bit about what happens post-consumption. Well, actually, let's talk a little bit about what happens just prior to consumption. So we know that cognitive and sensory enhancement of satiety and enzyme secretion is important. I'm sure you're all aware of a Russian called Pavlov who did some experiments with dogs. Now, you might think that dogs are fairly stupid, and so it's easy to train a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell. But actually, the same thing happens with us. So if we see a really appetizing food, we also start to salivate. We start to link the sight with the aroma and then sensations, and that makes us salivate more in expectation of consuming that food. And it's not just saliva, it is secretions further down the gastrointestinal tract as well. But that's complicated and has a lot of cognitive and psychoanalytical, psychological effects. And I'm not a psychologist. I'm a food scientist, so we're going to ignore that. So really, we'll say that food digestion starts with oral processing. And actually, the oral processing has multiple functions. So it's about release of aroma and taste and texture sensing. And a lot of the aroma, and particularly the taste around bitter taste, is about food safety. So if something tastes really bitter, you're likely to spit it out. And a lot of toxins and poisons are bitter. And so it's a kind of safety mechanism. It's not a very good one, but it's better than nothing. Then from the mouth, we go to the stomach, and gastric processing is about proteolysis and lipolysis and gradual acidification of the food and storage, essentially, so that it can then be gradually released into the small intestine for digesting. And in the stomach, there is also a small amount of mixing and grinding in the antral part. as indicated here, but in the main body of the stomach, there's little motion. And then we have intestinal processing, and that's really where digestion gets going with proteolysis and lipolysis and amylolysis, so the digestion of starch, and mixing, and more importantly, absorption. So most of the nutrients are absorbed in the small intestine. And as part of that, we have nutrient sensing. So you may think that you only taste food in the mouth, but actually you in many ways taste food all the way down the gastrointestinal tract, and they are, although not the same G protein coupled receptors, they are nonetheless from the same family, and they're responsible for the secretion of hormones, gastrointestinal hormones, and they link to appetite. So hormone secretion controls gastrointestinal motility, it controls enzyme and bile secretion, and it links into appetite. And so it's important to understand how that works if we're to affect, for example, appetite and consumption. I said that the stomach is basically involved in storage, and one of the things I'm interested in is what factors affect how long the food is stored there. So I'm just going to talk quickly about a study that we did looking at the effect of structure. So we prepared a couple of meals that had the same protein, fat, and carbohydrate, but had different structures. So one was a liquid sample and the other one was a semi-solid. And the aim was to determine whether a meal that sediments in the stomach could be used to increase fullness and decrease hunger. We were lucky enough to be able to use magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, to look at these, and that's what you're looking at here. And we were looking to see whether they affected appetite. So on the left, you can see the liquid meal, and on the right, you can see the semi-solid meal. And the bright in this is high water, and the dark regions are low water. So I don't think I'll see if I can get the pointer to work. Let's just go for that. Excellent. So we see the stomach here, and the liver and the spleen and the backbone. See, this is a participant lying on their back. And at the start, you see the liquid filling the stomach, and then you can see a grey line appear. And this is because the lipid tends to cream to the top. So you have the lipid of the emulsion creaming to the top of the stomach, which shows you there's not lots of mixing. And then in the semi-solid system, at the beginning, you see these dark regions in the stomach, and that is the boluses formed in the mouth that are essentially cheese boluses. And because they're high in lipid and protein, they're low in water and they show up dark. And actually, we're about to publish some data on analyzing the boluses in a range of meals. And this was a crossover study, and we measured the volume, and we collected data on satiety and also some hormones. And what we saw was that there were differences in the gastric volume, so we could measure the volume at each time point, and that's what we did. And because we knew what the volume was at each time point, of course, we could calculate the emptying rate. So although there are some errors in this, in that the secretion into the stomach isn't taken into account, nonetheless, you can see that the emptying rate overall is different. And where it's different is actually in the first 60 minutes, in the first hour. After that, both meals were essentially the same. And we've been looking more recently at that. So I have a master's student who's actually been analysing the data over the last few weeks. And she has shown that the bolus that we looked at in the previous slide, so the boluses that you can see at the beginning of the sequence, so here, they gradually disappear over the first hour, so that the system's two meals look identical after that. And after the first hour, it's not too surprising that they both look identical. So that was quite interesting. We compared also so the fullness of people and the hunger, and the semi-solid meal people were fuller for longer. So there was slower emptying at the start. So even though they emptied at the same rate subsequently, because they'd emptied more slowly at the start, there was more food in there for the 3 hours subsequently. And if you're fuller, you're generally less hungry. So there was lower hunger in the semi-solid meal. So overall, we could see that if only the structure is changed, you can affect feelings of appetite. And the reason for that is because you affect how long food stays in the stomach. We've also looked at more realistic meals. So here we had low energy density meal versus a high energy density meal. And the low energy density meal empties more quickly, but in reality, the emptying is controlled by the rate of calories being emptied. So if you have a low density, so in each of these cases, the kilocalories being emptied was about 2 kilocalories a minute. But because in the low energy density meal, you have a much larger volume, it gets emptied more quickly. So that obviously has an impact on fullness. So even though you have the same calories, because you've got the higher volume, you have more fullness, and that obviously affects how long you stay fuller for, and inversely affects the hunger rating in the same way. So you see the same sort of behavior that we saw previously. We've also looked at structure more systematically. So here we looked at oat flake porridge versus an oat flour porridge. So these are both porridges, but one has large particles in it and the other one has small particles. And here, this is images from the large particle. So you can see the stomach here, and you can almost see individual flakes of porridge in this, and then a liquid part of the meal at the top here. And after 20 minutes, we see that the volume is gone down, but what's been emptied is only this liquid part. So what tends to happen is liquid gets emptied from around a more solid bolus. So any liquid components can be emptied early on, but the overall emptying rate was not different between the two. Here you can see the time points that we used. And there were only minor differences towards the end of this. So some slight differences in gastric emptying rate, but we also measured the glycemic response, and as part of that, GIP, or the glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, which controls the rate of insulin secretion, or the amount of insulin secretion in response to glucose, very significantly. So there was a really big difference between the two types of porridge. So the rate of digestion changed somehow, and this interacted with this GIP. And this is secreted in response to glucose in the small intestine. If we then looked at insulin, it had an impact on insulin as well, but less significant than the GIP. And then if we look at glucose, there was no difference between the two. Now, this is because we were using healthy individuals, and in healthy individuals, glucose circulating in the blood is well controlled, and it's well controlled by insulin, and the amount of insulin that's secreted is in response to glucose, but it's also in response to GIP. So the combination of these two means that you don't see much of an effect on glucose. So actually looking at glucose in the blood doesn't necessarily tell you about what's happening in the digestive tract. So you need to be careful in interpreting the kind of nutrition experiments where you feed something and you measure something else in the blood, because it doesn't tell you everything. So in terms of conclusions for that part, some food structure is removed by chewing, but what remains can affect the rate of digestion. So we know that structure is important for gastric processing. Gastric emptying, as I mentioned, is driven by the energy density. It's also driven by particle size or texture of the bolus, rheology, if you like. And we know also that more food in the stomach makes you feel literally fuller. And if you're more full, you're less hungry and you're more satisfied. So you consume generally less. And we know that foods can be designed to optimize these processes. So now we understand some of the structures, we can start to design foods that make use of these processes and lower glycemic index. So more structure can give lower glycemic response and lower absorption of other bioactives. So bear in mind, if you want to encourage the absorption of, for example, carotenoids, having more structure there might actually be a problem. So that's a kind of larger scale gastric behavior. We can also start to look at fine structure. So in this case, protein gels with different structures. So we can make fine stranded gels with lots of charge on the protein, and we can make coarse particulate gels. So here, I don't know if you can see, but the bar here is 2 microns. So these gel particles are really large in comparison to the ones here, which are more than 10, more like 100 times smaller, and that can make a difference. So it makes a difference to the properties of the gel, obviously, but it also makes a difference to how they're digested. So if we put these through simulated digestion, a simulation of the gastric phase followed by a simulation of the early part of the small intestine, so the duodenum, then we can see differences, and we can see that, for example, our no heated control whey protein is quite resistant to pepsin. So we know that beta-lactoglobin is resistant to pepsin, but as soon as it goes into the small intestine, it's relatively quickly digested. But the system that had those large particles so close to the isoelectric point and heated, it is relatively resistant to digestion in the gastric phase, but it's also pretty resistant to digestion in the intestinal phase. So this could be a way of delaying protein digestion. Now, you might not want to do that. Often in terms of whey protein, you're looking for fast digestion, but that's not always the case. If you want controlled release of something, this could be an approach to use. You can also look at molecular structures in order to control rates of release and digestion. So this is an example, actually, it's quite an old one now, from an ex-colleague of mine, Pete Wild, and one of his colleagues. And they were looking at galactolipids, and these are plant lipids that have these large galactose head group. And this head group is large and blocks access to the interface. Now, for oil, that's important because all of the hydrolysis takes place at that interface. So here we have representations of the lipase and bile, and if the lipases can't get to this triglyceride interface, then it really affects the rate of hydrolysis. And you can see that in this case, the more digalactyl galactolipids they had in place, the slower it went. So this is the fatty acid release with none in, and as they went towards 100% on the surface, you saw a really significant drop in the rate. So by tuning what's on this surface, you can really have an impact. Now, that ends up being quite difficult in reality, because this interface tends to get modified as you go through digestion anyway. So this is a promising technique, but it's quite tricky to deliver in reality. So these are a couple of examples of manufactured structures, but what about natural structures? And I mentioned carotenoids earlier. So the effect in vivo on residence time on raw versus cooked carrot is quite interesting. So here we've got some data for raw grated carrot shreds. And these were recovered from ileostomy patients. So what happens is it passes all the way through the small intestine and then is recovered because these people have a bag that collects the ileostomy and bypasses the colon. And what you see is actually this is the original undigested raw shred, and then these are the edges of the shreds that have been through the digestive tract, and you can still see quite a lot of carotenoid in there. Now, why is that? Well, when you chew, you don't break open every single cell, and actually a lot of these cells are very difficult for the enzymes to get into, and of course they're also difficult for these compounds to get out of. So having raw carrot is not the best way to consume carotenoids and the structure is important in terms of what it delivers. Similarly, we have examples here of natural structures, and this is almond, and we know that the similar thing happens with almonds. So here you can see the starch has been labeled. Actually, on the right-hand side, you can see the starch has been labeled. On the left, these cells are so intact that even the label for the starch couldn't get in, which is why you see this boundary. And we know that the starch can't be released from these things. So a lot of the nutrients in things like almonds are never released because the cells are not broken open. So the conclusion from that is that both natural and design structures can alter digestion kinetics, and we know that natural structures can alter the extent of digestion. We know that model systems have been shown to work, but what about real food systems or a complete diet? Can we manipulate entire diets to do this? And does ultra processed food have too little persistent structure to be healthy? Is that really what's underlying the problem, or is it just the additives? And what roles do factors like palatability and acceptability play? Well, we know they're very important, because if people don't buy the food, then they're never going to consume it. So it doesn't matter how healthy the food is, if it's not palatable and acceptable, it's not going to be helpful. I think I'm short of time here, so I'm not going to go through the next section. I was thinking about passing on to something on mucosal permeability, but I think we're short of time, so I'm going to skip all that and we'll go just to the end. So in conclusion, the effects of processing on digestion kinetics are not simple. We've looked at a number of different processes, and you can see that they have different effects. In general, more processing leads to faster digestion, and this is one of the issues we've had around ultra processed foods. We know that caloric density and particle size are important factors for gastric residence time. And for many foods, there are multi-scale processing effects ranging from molecular to cellular to macroscopic, and all of these can have a role to play. And that digestion kinetics is determined by these multi-scale phenomena. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time. If you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mackie. It was a wonderful presentation. I already have some questions, but I will first ask the audience if they want to write something on our chat. Gente, quem tiver pergunta, pode perguntar aqui no chat, que eu posso ajudar a traduzir, se for o caso. Do you see the chat, Dr. Mackie?
I see the comments.
Okay. Well, while people are organizing their ideas, I would like to ask you a question. When you were talking about food waste and that graphic that started with reuse and use
Yeah.
for animals. So you're saying that around your campus there were cafes that were able to reuse food. Can you give me an example?
So
How do you
they,
reuse food?
yeah, it's an interesting concept. So what they do is they have agreements with local supermarkets so that when the best before date is reached, then normally the supermarket would just push the food to landfill or to waste. But these organizations arrange to collect the material and use it to cook straight away, because the best before doesn't mean that the food is not safe to eat. So they make use of these things. And in fact, we had a supermarket that worked on this process. It was more about food with longer shelf life um, than for perishable foods, but nonetheless, it worked really well. And it was called a share house because they were able to take the food from that would normally go to waste and distribute it to the poor.
Okay, yeah, it was completely different than what I was thinking, but it's about this expiration date. So use it before it goes to waste.
Yeah,
Thank
because
you.
markets don't keep the food until it has gone bad, because they want to sell good quality, and so there is this short window when you can make use of the food before it is too much destroyed.
Perfect. Mais alguém? Alguém quer fazer mais uma pergunta? Beth, Mariana, Edna. Our audience is shy.
I often have the same problem with my students.
Yeah, okay. Since nobody's talking, just a moment. Okay. Apparently, yeah, apparently there is another chat and we don't have access to that. Mariana, do you think that co-products or food industry residues can play a significant role in the development of plant-based food? And if you do so, what are the main challenges?
I think potentially they can play a role. I think the issue is always to do it in a way that is sustainable. And by sustainable, I don't just mean saves the planet, I mean is economically sustainable. So a lot of the novel processing and valorization around the use of enzymes and fermentation to produce further products, I think, helps these things become sustainable, so that we then have financial opportunities from what had been waste streams of food ingredients. And I think that makes plant-based food systems more economically viable. But I still think the main issues around plant-based are not necessarily to do with the quality. They're to do with the idea of a plant-based system, because somehow now meat consumption is associated with wealth. And if you're becoming wealthy, you don't want to be seen only to be eating plants, you want to be eating meat. And I think somehow we need to break this idea that you have to consume meat if you're becoming affluent. because the penalty is that we all become poorer because of climate change.
Ok. Mais alguém? Can you see that? And thank you so much.
It was surprising to me as well. Yeah, but and I think it is apparently focused on younger people. So younger people don't like cooking, and so they tend to go for faster food that is more processed. And so I think they bias it a little bit. And especially if I think about my students in the food science department, many of them are vegetarian, and lots of them don't put lots of effort into cooking. And so I can well understand that they might be eating more fast food than some of their meat-eating fellows.
Do you think plant-based meals are more difficult to cook?
No, I don't think that that's true. I think it depends what you're used to. I think in the past, many people were very used to cooking plant-based meals because meat was very expensive and not everybody could afford it. But now meat becomes very cheap and everybody considers it easy to cook, and it should form a part of the diet because there are some vitamins and nutrients that are difficult to obtain from a purely plant-based diet. But I think it's about culture, and I think this idea that fast food destroys food culture is interesting, and I think that this is where this kind of Brazilian idea of not having ultra processed food, not because of a health reason but for many other reasons, I think is really interesting. Well, I'm glad everybody enjoyed the presentation.
Anybody else?
If not, I'm always at the end of an email, so I'm happy for you to give people my email address and they can send an email if they have some questions or are interested in other things.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
So everybody, I will invite you all to the other room, the even room for the I forgot what's going to happen. Okay, the opening ceremony. That's it. Dr. Mackie, thank you again. And I hope we will be able to talk face-to-face very soon.
So do I. Thank you very much for your interest today, and enjoy the rest of your meeting. I hope it is successful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.